Hello. In 2010, the first ever feature-length movie set in the 40k universe was released. Ultramarines, a Warhammer 40,000 movie, was written by Black Library author Dan Abnett, and it followed a squad of Marines as they descended onto a feral planet and a fallen monastery. My guest today is the film's director, Martyn Pick. Beginning his career with art projects and commercials, Pick was brought into Ultramarines to create artistic, painterly visuals, frenetic action, and to lead character storytelling with a cast of incredible British actors. We talk about Pick's career and inspirations when making the film, the complexities of the technology and the business of creating an animation in the 40k universe, and how everything came together for the film's final release. I'm Jordan. This is Jordan Sorcery, and today I'm in conversation with Ultramarines director Martyn Pick. Martyn, thank you so much for joining me. We're going to be talking about the creation of the Ultramarines movie, the production, sort of how that went and how you became involved. I suppose the best place to start might be your background as an artist. Sort of how did you come into creating film and visual media?
Good morning, Jordan. I came into doing film. I was at art college at St. Martin's in London. And originally, I was going to be a painter, but when I was on my foundation course, I experimented with charcoal animation. Basically, these are the old days of film, basically building up drawings frame by frame on the camera. So I got into this thing of like fine art, animation, a drawing evolving in front of you. And that suddenly that opened up to me to think, okay, that's painting, but you can take it into a time-based medium. And it was a period when like MTV was opening up, and I thought, well, this is different. And also, animation at that time was very much dominated by Disney in people's perception, or purely kind of kids animation. And I thought, well, this is a different angle. You can do stuff with different content, adult content, darker content, or with an art style. So I thought this is fertile ground. So I did, effectively an experimental film course. Then I left college and continued working as an editor. I made my own films. I sold them to Channel 4. I started to do pop promos for like Susan the Banshees and stuff like that. I got grants from the BFI, Arts Council. So I carried on, often kind of dark charcoal aesthetic, dark content, fluid animation. And then I started working in West End studios, animation studios as a director. Because initially I started out, I was director, writer, rostrum cameraman, editor, the whole thing. And as I got into more commercial production, I needed to delegate because of the size of the production. So I learned more how to direct, keep your tone, but then pass it on and work with a team. And then after a while, it had up to a point all been drawn. It either been pastel, oil pastel, Rembrandt pastel, charcoal, frame by frame. But I thought, well, I could see digital stuff was coming in. So I started to incorporate that. So I started incorporating into my work CGI, which I texture. I'd started to incorporate live action. I was always very keen on live action acting. I never went down, I never developed into a Disney animation style. It was always about, if it was going to be character, it was going to be a live action character in a certain way that you do that with acting, which we'll get on to in the film. So I incorporated that. So I was mixing media and the art, doing short films. And then, I started to break into long form. And I've done a few pieces on some documentary features, such as The Age of Stupid, which is a climate change feature. I did like dystopian landscapes. And also in the run-up to the Warhammer film, I'd done my short film Plaza, Channel 4, which is a kind of George A. Romero dystopian view of commercial desires eating people alive. You know, it's like an animated desire erupts out of live action, which is a big thing in my work.
Right.
In to that, and I don't, I don't limited edition graphic novel. So I built up this work, and yeah, and then the Warhammer feature came my way.
Right. Okay. Yeah, that's great. Would it be right to describe some of what you were saying that you sort of evolved into in the commercial space with live action and animation? Is that sort of like rotoscoping, that kind of thing, or is it a different kind of blend of those techniques?
I mean, it's not rotoscoping per se in that it's just purely lifting the data from live action to make animation more realistic or to lessen the workload. It's more like taking live action, keeping the live action source there and working into it. So often there'll be a photographic element still bleeding through.
Oh, right. Okay.
And then in recent years, I mean, at that stage, it'd be like I was experimenting with almost like sort of collage environments where you'd have a live action actors with matte painted backgrounds and getting the lighting and the color and the grade to match,
Right.
before 300, which is why I thought it was a revelation when 300 came out, because I've been experimenting that kind of world, I was always interested in that kind of space.
Right.
And a lot of it was, my love of live action. I love Sergio Leone. I love how he could hold a close up on a human face for a huge amount of time, and you just get the life experience that's in the texture of that face, and the slightest inflection comes through, and that's very different to animated acting, which is very traditionally is a lot more puppeted. It's like someone has a quizzical thought, then they get them to raise an eyebrow or whatever. You go that way. It's a different. It's got its own. Tyler's got its own authenticity, but you're coming from a different route. I mean, it's obviously changing now a lot, but in those days, it was. I was intrigued with the subtlety and nuance of live action acting, and how you could get things in the soul and the expression. Stuff.
Right.
And then also mixing that into a painterly world, And I was very influenced by things like, matte painted movies, like early RKO movies like Citizen Kane, which is a huge use in that. Matte painted backgrounds and strong lighting where everything just gels into this whole environment. King Kong, 1933 King Kong, Powell Pressburger, Black Narcissus, things like this.
Sure. Yeah. I suppose that sort of thing allowed those directors and creators to do things that the special effects of the time wouldn't be able to achieve, right? Because you can create vast cityscapes in a metropolis, for instance, that you wouldn't be able to actually build using those kind of interactions between the matte paintings and the physical people.
Yeah, but then also a lot of it's to do with lighting and tone. So it's not just about creating a photoreal environment, but they'd have like an art style,
Sure.
A lot of that comes from Germany, German expressionism and stuff like that, where you'd have an atmosphere and a tone that holds the whole thing together. So it's not purely about creating a photoreal sense. In those days, they couldn't. But I mean, you look at the 1933 King Kong, it's got these amazing kind of matte paintings in the backgrounds that look like Gustave Doré drawings. If you ever see Gustave Doré's work, Dante's Inferno in the 19th century, and it's got that kind of feel to it. And yeah, I really responded to that rather than just pure photorealism. Which when I saw particularly 300, penny dropped that an audience was ready for this because of what they'd been seeing in graphic novels, in games, that kind of more atmospheric, subjective reality. We're telling you a story and it's in this world, rather than a photoreal reality like maybe Troy a few years before.
Right, sure.
And that chimed with my existing work. I mean, interestingly enough, shortly before I did the Warhammer film, as I mentioned, I'd done these apocalyptic sequences for a climate change feature film, The Age of Stupid, which had, a lot of the similar influences in terms of devastated worlds, the painterly sense of cataclysm, painting into pixels, the sense of drama in the lighting, the use of the rich matte paintings, but for the narrative ends of showing how the world could be ravaged by climate change in the year 2050. And that's just in the run-up to Ultramarines. Subsequently, since Ultramarines, I've worked on numerous kids' CGI superhero shows for Netflix as well.
Right.
RoboZuna, I was head of story voice director on Kitty Cats, which is a girl's superhero thing. Really that kind of pop art animated feel to that world.
Right.
A degree of Marvel influence as well. Again, drawing. In my case, I've been bringing influences from like Frank Miller and the dynamics of Jack Kirby in terms of some of the staging.
So all of these sort of interests and influences then are sort of, it seems like, or it feels like maybe these were starting to come together and coalesce into this Ultramarines project. But where did that film come from? How did Ultramarines come to be?
Well, I mean, with my artwork, again, the influence of like 19th century romantic painting, like Delacroix, Turner, Jericho, mixed in with photographic elements. I've been developing that a lot in my commercial work and my short films, and in a graphic novel that I did of my own back and had published limited edition through a university in the US. And that graphic novel showed my cinematic scale of visualization that I hadn't been able to do yet within what's the projects that come my way as a drama. You got glimpses of it in my commercials, but as a whole drama, you hadn't seen that yet. So it was in that graphic novel, and a producer saw that, and based on the fact that I'd done, plenty of solid commercial work, and it gave me the opportunity to do a test for the Ultramarines film, where we did a show. We had a budget. There was a projected budget that was going to be based on the Warhammer fans around the globe. So Hollywood had come calling previously with Games Workshop, but I think probably always been that they were going to sort of broaden it out too much, like they do with comic book IPs, existing comic book IPs, and soften it, put in too much cheesy, family-friendly humor, love interests, and stuff like that, and reduce the very specific tone that Games Workshop is known for.
Right.
And the script that had been developed by Dan Abnett, who obviously is a big Games Workshop writer, was very spot on that tone. So it was going to go down that route, and it wasn't going to compromise and go direct to those fans. So the budget was based around that audience around the globe, which is substantial, but at that time, it wouldn't have the reach of selling, a Marvel movie through all the big cinema outlets. So the budget was projected, it was, about £6 million.
Right. And
the CGI, that's a decent budget, but that is not, that's not a Hollywood, VFX extravaganza budget. That'd be about 10 times that amount.
Right. So
we had to do a test where we would show that we would capture certain things like facial capture. It's going to be facial capture of actors put on a rig, and then key animated bodies, and do that within a matte painted world and get everything to cohere within a look that would gel and work within that money. And we did a test, and that was to be presented to Games Workshop for them to tick it off and license it. And Games Workshop loved it. So from then on, I was attached to it as director.
Right. Okay.
Based on my previous credits. And, was involved for a year or so as this project was set up.
Right. That's really interesting then. So before Games Workshop had sort of signed off on the project, then, is this the kind of, so the producer who'd sort of engaged you and brought you in, presumably had been working with Dan Abnett in some capacity to get a script going? And so that was all happening as a sort of a pitch, I guess, to Games Workshop, was it? Like, we would love to make this film. We've invested this time to show you what it would look like and how it might work. And then GW had to then say, yes, okay, let's do it.
Yeah. It was Bob Thompson. He'd been working with Dan Abnett on developing the script. And that was, that had been going on for a while before I came on board. So it was already pre-developed. Yeah. It was already pretty much there. And then Games Workshop knew about it. I've gone to, I've been to the NEC, I've been to Games Day and all of that, and immersed myself in the mythology and worked on the script. But we needed to show as a sample that the piece could work.
Right.
And it was basically what we say in CGI testing the pipeline. Yeah.
Right. Sure.
And the thing is that, coming back again to what I was saying about live action acting, it was about capturing those nuances, because the characters in the film, they're Marines. It's not it's not an overly gestural, emotive Disney movie where they're all bouncing around. They do all these kind of flowery movements and stuff like that. These are stoical guys who rein it in.
Yeah.
And within that, it's quite a tight range of acting as well, because they look quite similar. They've got similar haircuts. They speak in the same way. They've got received pronunciation. You can't speak with contractions. So it's quite a tight range, in range of what the acting is. It's not your conventional war movie where you get someone really gung-ho and get someone who's like, has been conscripted and, is crying for their mum or something like that. That's not going to happen. These guys are all into the project, they're all into the war. And we had to convey that. So it requires a lot of subtlety. So it's not broad acting. It's not puppeteering. And the best way we decided to do that was to do facial capture.
Right, yeah.
So working with a company just on Benjamin Button, who won an Oscar for it. It was a medical imaging system. So the actor would appear. You'd capture them, face on, like I'm now. We just move from side to side, a certain degree of movement. And then the footage would be captured HD. And that then would go down to a medical imaging system, which would then capture all the data. And then that's onto a rig, onto the head. Yeah. So it's all about capturing those subtleties. And then we did it on the test, and that was, it was very finessed, as you can see.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually, because on the behind-the-scenes footage from the movie, the sort of the release, you show some of that facial capture stuff and some of the actors performing and being shot in that way so they can be scanned. Now, I think a lot of people who have seen behind-the-scenes footage for CGI generation stuff will see it with that called the dots and the different things on people's faces to kind of capture the movement of the face. That wasn't used for this. So is this technology, and like you say, if it was used for Benjamin Button as well, which was also very successful, like it can achieve that level of capture in the same way without those kinds of dots and stuff like that?
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, that was a big thing. Obviously, for the, we had sort of top tier talent there. Like John Hurt, Terence Stamp, and Sean Kirby, and all the guys. And it was important that they were comfortable. and relaxed. So I mean, it wasn't too, that stuff business of putting the dots on it is a bit of a fiddle, and um, it's it meant that there was a degree of fluency there. Yeah.
Right. Yeah.
Obviously now, I mean, I've done it since, and people do it different ways, but I think the capture can be done.
Great.
Very fluidly. But,
yeah, you mentioned the cast there as well, and it is a sort of incredible talent, a bench of talent performing as these different Marines. Like you say, you've got John Hurt and Sean Pertwee and Terence Stamp and other great character actors as well.
Yeah.
How did you put that cast together for the film?
Well, once the film was greenlit and we were in pre-production, casting agent could go out with confidence to actors and say, this is a Warhammer movie,
right?
And they think, wow, I mean, specific examples was that John Hurt's son played Warhammer, was a big fan,
right?
And he knew about it, and his angle on it was that it was the Knights Templar,
right?
Focused on that, his hook. Terence Stamp saw it as a great return to genre for himself because he'd done General Zod in Superman 2.
Of course, yeah.
Yeah, and he'd been in the Phantom Menace. Yeah, they were all into it, I mean, Stephen Waddington has done lots of great work, like Game of Thrones. And,
yeah.
Johnny Harris, who'd just been in London to Brighton, has done great work. Don Sumpter was in Game of Thrones.
Of course, yeah. And like you say, one of the challenges I imagine for Space Marines, I mean, you talked about it a little bit there, where these are all, certainly on the tabletop, they are all very similar. They're uniform, they're experts, they're very precise in their movements and their abilities. Creating the distinctions between those characters in the movie so that we understand who's doing what and what are the sort of dynamics between the party, that's a challenge, a difficult one. Some of that's going to come down to the writing, some of that's going to come down to the acting. I mean, did you sort of, was there a sort of any difficulty in the production to you were watching and you say, we just don't feel like these are different enough, or did it sort of come naturally through the process?
Well, we had to pay a lot of attention to it,
right?
Especially when they had the helmets on.
Sure, yes.
You're gone, But I mean, that's why the voice acting is very important, and I think that what they've done, Dan Abnett and Bob have done, they've worked a lot on getting the character dynamics there. It is difficult because it is different to, the classic model in cinema, going back to things like, Stagecoach or something like that, where you have a small group of people in hostile terrain. Or in Stagecoach, John Wayne's a hero, but there's a guy in there who's a whiskey drover who is not.
Oh.
He's a coward, just wants to get home to his family. Not a coward, but he's a pacifist. And in this, everyone's motivation is to show themselves in battle and to achieve the ends. And it's all in the shading of how you get to that point and what your methodology is. And the main character's arc is he has to learn it's about victory, not about glory, and about the competence of achieving it. And then you have Python, the apothecary, who's very cynical. You've got different tones. You've got Verna, who comes up, with this he's always undercutting Proteus, the lead, Stephen Waddington playing off Sean Pertwee. So I think a lot of shade had been put into it, which I think is great.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's definitely a challenge, but I think we did well. I think the voice acting is great.
It is, yeah, and it definitely carries the performances definitely do give you that sense of distinction between the different characters as you progress through that narrative. But I was curious actually about the story that was chosen itself. Obviously, it's a lot more focused and restrained. It's not an epic sort of battle. It's not an invasion. This is one squad. We're quite tight in on these guys, and we follow them on one particular mission. Can you talk a little bit about like how that story was arrived at and what drove that?
Again, the script was pretty developed by the time I came on board. So I came on board at the point where I was directing the test. But I mean, I was happy that it was like that, because in doing the test, I've done quite a few, numerous commercials. The thing is, when you're doing commercials, is that you can, by the client and the agency, be given a degree of creative freedom with what goes on for 25 seconds of the ad, but then they'll be all over the pack shot when their product appears at the end.
Right.
Well, no. On the 30-second test for Ultramarines, we've got there's constant, through our guy at Games Workshop, there's constant notes on getting it right. So I was aware that the detail in this universe was going to have to be honoured and thought through on every shot. So it meant that there's going to be a lot of toing and froing within the headspace of the production, the bandwidth. Yeah. So I was glad that it was a lean story because of that process that was needed to happen, right. Which of course I'm massive respect for, because the law is so intricate, and that's why we were doing it, because we weren't going to soften it or broaden it out. We were going to keep to that. So that detail is very important. But I was aware that a lot of time was going to spend on doing that. So the fact that it was a relatively simple narrative, a lean narrative, I think was a good thing, because then we could really focus on those details and get them right. Story-wise, I think it's great too, because you're not being over-ambitious. You're not trying to do a sort of, you're not trying to show the whole universe that falling down. You're focusing on one detail, and within that detail, then you can allude to the rest of it. And I think that works. Like Hemingway, the American writer, said you get one detail right and shows the rest of the world. And try to do that. The film alludes to McCrack, it alludes to the Emperor, but you don't see that. And I think you can do a lot with that. There's a great tradition of that in cinema. Platoon, John Carpenter's The Thing, Aliens, Warriors, and dramatically it always works. That thing of having a small group going through hostile terrain, going through a challenge, going on a quest, and then the group dynamic and the acting between them, and how they play off against each other. In our case, one of them contaminated as well, which again, that thing, and that's always a great template. So I think rather than try and stretch ourselves too thin and get bogged down in exposition and detail that was too much out, which was great to keep it focused. Outside of the culture, specific kind of sci-fi culture, a big interesting influence for me on this film was French Connection. Gene Hackman recently sadly passed away. But in terms of, in that film, it's shot on the real streets of New York in the early 70s, unvarnished as it was, captures the grimy reality of it, the grime and the glitz. And you spend a lot of time with these two rough cops, the Gene Hackman character, which is not a character, and the way they talk, they're real raw guys who they get the job done, but not necessarily, they're not the politest. It's not a sanitized view. It's real. And you spend a lot of time with them, and you're immersed in that universe, and then the action kicks off, almost in the third act, where you get the famous shooting of Popeye Doll and the car chase. And in our movie, because we had the £6 million, we didn't have the resources of, say, Michael Bay in Hollywood, where you start off with a fight on the ledge of a tower block, and then 20 minutes in you go bigger and have a fight at sea, and then 20 minutes after that you go to outer space, and then after that you go to metaverse. You just keep going up and up and up. We could go to a certain level with our animation and our world, and so we had to hold that back, restrain that for the audience, and then deliver it to it after a certain period. So we had to do the thing of spending a lot of time with our guys, with our squad, and getting to know them and immerse in their tone and the texture of their voices, their Warhammer world, which is similar to French Connection. And then the action kicks in with the fight in the crags, and then the fight in the shrine later on as the film goes on.
Yeah.
Which I think is correct for the world as well. I wouldn't have gone, that's sort of escalation. Only, it needs to be justified, and it can often just be papering over plot. And in our case, we were trying to convey the tone and introduce people to the world and lead them into it through character.
Yeah, and some of those are the most successful scenes as well, I think. They're actually the downtime almost with the Marines, and you do get to see a bit of the character. And it's one of the things, there's a number of things that you don't see elsewhere in the 40k universe, really. Because it's a game about fighting the battles, you don't tend to get to see them on the way to the battle, which is quite nice. It's an insight that you wouldn't otherwise have.
Yes. All the time of the prep, and a lot of credit to the script writing there. I found Dan Abnett's. I really enjoyed the sort of texture Dan Abnett's writing, the tone of it. Very rich.
Yeah,
and with a real kind of sort of Macbeth kind of authenticity to it, the grimness.
Yeah, absolutely.
Never playing outside of the world and treating it dead straight and following it.
Yeah, and still moments of brevity and a couple of little bits.
Yeah, when they're having digs at each other. Yes.
Yeah.
the sniping between the guys. There is,
yeah.
It is there, but it's always framed within that world. It's never playing it too broad.
Yeah,
it's important.
Which does remind of Aliens as well, which you mentioned before, as just similarly, those equipping and sort of getting ready scenes, they are really important to getting you to know the characters so that when you go on the mission, you're then invested more in who they are. Here it does double duty because it, as we were saying before, helps to create the distinctions between the Marines, who are a lot more similar in a Space Marine squad than in a Colonial Marine squad.
Yeah, and then you're prepared for how they're going to play out in combat as well. How they're going to react. Yeah, it's important. With the the playing it straight down the line. That is something I do appreciate about Zack Snyder. I think he takes material that other people might think is pulpy, but he plays it like it's opera. Have real emotion to it, and he doesn't sort of make it into. He doesn't try to justify by giving too much kind of sociological, political context. Like some superhero movies do. And you almost end up thinking, so why do we have a guy with his own pants and his trousers in this at all? Why isn't it straight police procedure? He doesn't do that, and neither does he play it so ironically. He's not playing it like you're in on a gag about it. He's playing it. He's invested in the emotion of it. And I like that. Interest.
Very much looking for the mythological aspects of those stories, isn't it? Like creating it as a larger than life heroes, that sort of thing.
Yes. Yeah. As I've illustrated Book the Penguin on Beowulf, which is that Dark Ages universe, which I think tonally is similar to the intellectual world. I'm, interested in the lore of that time, and I've been interested in those narratives. The one I picked up, which is the god Odin, which is the earliest poem to mention King Arthur, and it's a story of the Celts fighting the Saxons. And it's a last stand, like 300, but it was the ancient Britons fighting the Saxons. Right. And the poem is reportage of each of the Celtic warriors who died in battle. And each poem records how valiant this man was. Normally how good a hunter he was, or how he drank his mead and was very convivial, or how good he was in his coracle, and how many Saxons he felled before he met his untimely end. But, yeah,
right. Very fascinating. That's amazing. Yeah, I've not heard of that. That sounds really fascinating.
Yeah, got heard it. Yeah.
Right.
And there is a very first mention of King Arthur in there. Mm. And it's evidently based on a real battle, but that sort of sporadically undocumented time when the Saxons were making headway across this country, but the Romans had left, so you had the Celts or the Romanized Celts or the pure Celts, on the fringes in Wales or Scotland, fighting back against those forces. And this is that last stand.
Yeah, and then when you actually came to create the world in which this story takes place, obviously there's, I'm assuming there's a lot of influence from Warhammer 40,000 itself and a lot of the material that exists. Was there anything else that you were bringing in, whether that was technological or artistic, into the world as you were helping to create it?
Yeah, I mean, first of all, artistically, again, I would say I took through my influences. There's the kind of expressionistic painting, German expressionistic painting, the 19th century romantic painting, where you see landscape in tumult with emotion, turbulence, Delacroix, Jericho, that kind of deep tone, Caravaggio with the lighting, Rembrandt again with the lighting, strong. A lot of it, was concentrating on getting strong key lights. You get strong key light that hits you on one side of the head and casts a shadow, and then certain areas go into dark, and then you apply that to the matte paintings or environments in the background. The whole image then gels. That was very important. We had artists working storyboarding who come from, were handpicked for their skills, but also they'd come from, quite a few of them worked for 2000 AD. So that's like a hardcore UK brand. So they brought that kind of tough, terse, sci-fi feel to it. Some of them worked for Marvel. As cinematically, we look a lot at things like you've got figures in a bleak landscape. We look at a lot of things like Sergio Leone, Fistful of Dollars trilogy, Once Upon a Time in the West, Kurosawa, Seven Samurai, Yojimbo, Throne of Blood. How you can focus your eye on a character in quite a spare landscape, and that can say a lot. And then you've got the figure, and you've got a degree of the sky around, a degree of mist and atmosphere and texture, but your eyes on the figure and how that, it's not cluttered, it's very lean. Lawrence of Arabia. Cinematically, Sam Peckinpah. Technologically, we, things were very tightly previs. So we'd work, alongside the image metrics, where we were actually working out the animation for the film. It was drawn first, I'd do my rough sketches initially, then that's passed on to the team. There was like head of storyboard, Stan Fawcett, and then the artists, as I mentioned, a lot 2000 AD artists, like David Roach, who would then flesh it out, and that's all drawn, and that's all to give the field, and Games Workshop would see that. That's selling the whole feel of the film, first of all. Yeah. The tone of it, the action. And then you go through the next process where you go into blocking it out in CGI. You translate that into CGI space.
Mm.
And then it becomes very kind of blocky and grey. And you wouldn't show that to, you wouldn't show that to the client at that point in time. There's a gap, where things get a bit more pedestrian, because you're really just working at where people are standing and where the camera angle is. But you're retaining the essence of what you've sold on the draw pass. And then you come to the next stage, which is like the animation, put the facial capture in there, and it all comes to life and becomes a lot more exciting to the clients again. Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But just on that, was there ever a point at which a sort of more traditional animation was ever considered, or was it always going to be the sort of CG, the generated imagery?
It might have been, but that wouldn't have been with my involvement, because, as I said earlier, because of my background in both live action, in pure live action, mixed live action, and my dark aesthetic with animation, how they combined. When I was involved, it was going down this route. So
sure, yeah, yeah, and you talked about the sort of painterly style of some of your earlier work as well, and I think that's certainly something that is in this film, and trying to capture some of that, right? Like even some of the influences that you mentioned when it was like the what is it, the chiaroscuro sort of darkness, and kind of create those spaces and those vast desolate landscapes. I suppose one sort of thought, just in terms of the influences from Leone or Kurosawa, when you get those kind of still moments in those desolate landscapes, and you are, like you say, your eye is drawn to those characters that are in those spaces. Is there a challenge when it comes to translating that sort of style to animation, where the stillness could be mistaken for, instead of it being a choice and a sort of, this is something we're trying to evoke, and we're trying to present a feeling for this character, some people might be like, okay, well, they've just not animated this bit, for example. Like, is that must feel that must be a bit of a challenge in it.
Well, that's maybe it was audacious on our part, but that was not the
Sure.
not the intention. The intention was that it was a slow build, atmospheric slow build, and you got to know the characters, and then the action kicks off. First major fight's the fight in the crags, then there's a fight in the shrine, and then the big epic desert battle at the end, and then demon fight. Series of set pieces. It certainly wouldn't be our intention. The thing with using the image metrics facial capture was that when we did the test, it was so transparent at coming through what the actor Gary Martyn did on the test with the facial capture, that my handle on the acting, both the acting and the animation, was like, we just treat this like live action. We're not gonna. And that wasn't just purely a stylistic choice on my part. It was because it was Warhammer, and it was the tone of the world I was looking at.
Sure.
It wasn't cartoony. It was austere and rigorous, as if it was a Clint Eastwood war movie or something like that.
Yeah.
The work, when it went into production, because of the deals that necessarily had to be set up, some things did get crushed. So some of the processing of the facial capture wasn't quite as transparent as it had been in the test.
Right.
Which we then had to compensate for by adding extra bits of acting. You then keyframe it.
Right.
Yeah. So you've got the data. I directed this Abbey Road, and I directed just like it is, like, keep it straight down the line, play it straight. But when it was cutting out, and you're losing a little bit of subtlety and nuance because of that, then you have to push it.
Right. One of the things that I think the film does really well is capture the scale of the world. Like, I really like the start of the movie, where it's on the Space Marine ship, and not only is it a cathedral in space, which is great, and you've got the stained glass window and everything like that, which is fantastic, but then you see the Thunderhawk gunship flying away, and there is this the ship is enormous, and then you really do get that, and same again with the sort of world that they go to. I mean, was that something that you were keen to sort of try and capture and bring to life as well? Because I think that 40K's scale has always been one of its both its most absurd, but also one of its most characterful elements, I think.
Yeah, I mean, you have to remember that every asset we created on the film, every element, would be constantly sent back to Games Workshop for approval.
Sure.
So you get notes back and I'll make it bigger. But I'm not against it. I love grandeur in films, and if you can do that without clutter, I love it visually.
Hmm.
You know, I look a lot at Fritz Lang's Die Nibelungen. I pronounced that badly, but it's his, before he did Metropolis, it's his 1920s version of ancient German myths that were the original source of Wagner's Ring Cycle as well. It has a hero Siegfried. It's very much in the same zone, and he does a huge amount with scale. He'll have huge kind of abstract or huge walls and then a figure small in the space, so you get that sense of scale. And that comes back to Sergio Leone as well, what he would do with really tight close-ups on eyes and then a figure also as a pinprick in the distance, so you get that kind of dynamic. Visually I like that.
Yeah.
I always get disappointed when I see an epic movie that's like kind of boxy and everyone's in this kind of middle theatrical space, and when you see Leone do it, he's just out in a bit of parched land in Spain. You can get that, and yes, with the Warhammer stuff, we did do that kind of rich cathedral-like space of both the ship and the shrine they go to as well.
Sure.
Toppled figures and everything like that. That sense of awe and majesty.
Was it quite difficult to get the sort of the not the scale necessarily, but the proportions and the physicality of the Marines? Because obviously these are, I guess you benefit from there not being a lot of non-Marine characters in the film.
Yeah.
But were you to put them next to a regular human, obviously they'd be massive. They don't have a human's proportions. They don't move in the same way as a human. So it must be a challenge to kind of create that believable weight, but also the flexibility and athleticism that you expect a Marine to have.
Yeah, I mean, again, we were very faithful to the notes we got from Games Workshop. It was they were worked out to exact scale. Obviously with the facial capture, that's then put on a head that's then scaled up. So all of that works, and then the bodies are then keyframe animated in Canada. So all of that was worked out to how the armor would move. Yeah.
Right.
So within the parameters of the production, because we had a year to do it. And
sure.
it was a studio that had just been set up. So
yeah. And then
all the intention was to follow that, and create that sense of scale. But yes, you're right. Because there's no human scale in them, you don't quite get the height of them.
Sure, yeah, because they must be
human beings. Yeah. They're big guys.
Yeah. How did you then direct the actual and create those action scenes then? So, because what was the sort of the thinking going into, okay, we want these to be sort of dynamic and action-filled moments?
Yeah, I mean, I'm a massive Sam Peckinpah fan. So I'll endlessly watch the final gunfight in the Wild Bunch where they take on the Mexican War, and the cross-cutting of that, both because it's exciting cinema, because of the cutting and the sort of spontaneity of it, but also because it throws you into the action and you get multiple points of view, different characters. In recent years, that's been done by Paul Greengrass, the Bourne movies, and Steven Spielberg, Saving Private Ryan as well. That multiple camera, very kind of choppy feel, almost like documentary like you've got multiple cameras in there, and Oliver Stone as well, JFK, you know, very much into getting that visceral, exciting, spontaneous feel. You see, with animation, again, because with animation, the big difference, you know, because I've done loads of work in live action, loads of work in animation, the real big difference is the editing. Because in animation, you edit before you commit to your full color materials because it's so expensive and time consuming to render. So you pre-plan. Whereas in live action, you get your expensive materials on set and then you can move your camera around it. So I was into simulating that kind of Wild Bunch, Saving Private Ryan energy, crosscut energy. But you wouldn't be able to do that in animation where you'd have your battle scene, your big desert battle scenes with the Marines and Chaos, and have multiple cameras and then give it to an editor and you can chop between them. We studied those clips and actually did it shot by shot. So we'd work out, here's the first shot, get up to that point, hand that over to another board artist, and then we'd simulate like camera weave and wobble. So you get things like camera shake when there's an impact on the ground, when a bolter goes off, or that kind of verite thing that you get in Saving Private Ryan, and you get in real war footage and real news footage where a cameraman's will move on to a subject and move past it, then come back onto it because they're trying to find the point. Rather than in a lot of animation, traditional animation, things are very storyboarded and very clearly directed. You know, your eye is now going to him, Pixar. You know, now we're looking at this. You know, very. You know, there's a beauty to that. But I was into this kind of visceral, gritty thing. And I wanted to break it up and give that kind of spontaneity. So that's very important, and get that. That sense of sort of fragmented experience, you know, that you're thrown into. And interesting, I mean, I've done it since. There's a documentary feature, Coup 53, where I had to create these riot scenes in Tehran in the 1950s. This was directed by Taghi Amirani. It's a movie about CIA and MI6 destabilizing Iran in the 50s to gain control of the oil. And there were these riots that were set up by our secret forces in Iran that then meant that they could put the Shah in to restore order. But anyway, I was directing these action scenes, which were these riots, which were a mixture of archive and staged live action that was all going to be painted into. So we shot guys dressed up as soldiers, green screen, and we shot them. This was much more like the Peckinpah live action route. You know, we had single red camera that captured the main action, and then I encouraged everyone to film the rest of the action on their mobile phones. So we have multiple passes on the same action.
Right.
And then, because it was being edited by Walter Murch, who cut Apocalypse Now, he's one of the world's greatest editors, thought, well, I'll give him something to play with. I don't want to do the Pixar thing where you know, there's no latitude in the editing. I want to get that spontaneity and feel and freedom to it. So he was given that route. So effectively, I was doing the same thing as I did in Ultramarines, but in that case, I was going down the live action route. So if you've got a scene where there's a bunch of soldiers, you know, they're shooting and then four of them get hit and fall down, we have multiple passes on that Walter would then cut between to get that action. Whereas what's interesting in Ultramarines is we simulated that by going from one shot to the other. But it's all to get the same feel.
Sure. I imagine the logistics of storyboarding that and sort of pre-visualizing all of those different cuts must have been quite complex to get your head around.
Well, and the main things, yeah, I mean, it's like however confusing it looks, the audience will know if it's wrong.
Right.
You know, so the geography has to be right. So what you have to do is very carefully block out all the actions step by step of where your characters are. So you basically work out battle plans, floor plans for where the characters are, where they're standing, where they move to, where the opponents are coming to, who gets shot at what stage. So you do that first. And then you work out where to put the cameras, which is what you do, exactly what you do in live action. You know, if you're going out to the desert and shooting that battle scene, you get all your extras and crew and get them out there and rehearse it visually, first of all, see it all, and then the DOP would follow the viewfinder and say, oh, we've got shot here, here, and here, and where to put the cameras and pick it up.
Right. Yeah. You mentioned before 300, the Zack Snyder film, which obviously has got quite an abstract level of action, like the interaction between the action and the backgrounds, and there's a certain level of abstraction that's quite interesting. There is I think I'm right that there's a moment or two in Ultramarines where the sort of bolter rounds kind of almost, I don't know how to describe it. It's almost like they're piercing the world almost. There's like a certain effect there. Is that what was going on there?
The fragmentation of the image, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. I mean, that's something I've developed in my work over a lot of time. I did this film for, again, going back to my Channel 4 short Plaza, where animated desire rips apart live action stability. You know, but it breaks through. First of all, the live action starts to fragment, as if the emotion's bashing behind the door, bashing behind the frame until it cracks.
Right.
And that visceral sense that I always think it's a bit like feedback in music, you know, where the recording can't actually cope with the intensity of the sound. You know, at certain points, the intensity of what's happening is too much for the picture.
Sure.
You know, and it fragments, and that's the bolter going off. So it's giving it extra kick, you know, in conjunction with the sound design to give it that wallop, you know.
Yeah. I mean, it's really Yeah, and because there's almost like a meta textual element to that as well, isn't it? Because you're highlighting the medium at the same time as using it to reinforce the narrative, which is really interesting.
Yeah. It's like the physicality of the medium can't cope with the intensity of that moment, of that second. Yeah. And it comes out, you know, it comes from my art background as well, like abstract painting and stuff like that. You know, abstract expressionism, Jackson Pollock, Clifford Still, and stuff like that. They have these wild gestural things that show kind of raw emotion. It's about that, you know, it's at that point in time when you can't convey it. It's got to go to a new level. Yeah.
Were there any other influences, whether it's film or mythology or music or anything like that played a role in your sort of process?
Yeah, I mean, with music, there's quite a lot. I mean, there's again going back to, I mean, I've talked about like 19th century kind of romanticism, you know, that kind of idea of emotional turbulence as a reaction to the Industrial Revolution that you get in Turner and Jericho and Delacroix and William Blake. That's very important to me, or something I've studied a lot, that idea of how you sort of convey that sort of subconscious erupting. And that subconscious erupting, again, that kind of emotion is again like the fragmentation of the frame, you know, the abstraction that you get in Jackson Pollock and Clifford Still and Rothko, is, you know, that's a key element in my work and a thread that goes through it. And then musically, Beethoven and Wagner, that sense of scale and drama as well is very important. So in terms of the kind of grittiness and a visceral nature, punk rock impacted me a lot when I was younger. Sex Pistols, and then, you know, like the American proto-punk bands like the MC5 and the Stooges and stuff like that. And UK metal as well, like Black Sabbath. And I always think it's interesting, like the Midlands link to Games Workshop, you know, an industrial space. You know, the Stooges and the MC5 come from Detroit, where car manufacturing. and then Black Sabbath from heavy industry in Birmingham, and then there's a lot about kind of nostalgia, not nostalgia, but for an affinity for industry metal forging, that kind of world, that kind of sense of texture. And I feel Games Workshop, is in that universe. I mean, with me, I've always been into, film and mythology. So I've always, child, I was into early Marvel, the primal myths of like the early Marvel, Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, and how they quite simply created humanity in those spaces. It was really good. Universal horror for its rich tone and art direction, and that sort of interesting mix of UK character acting in Universal horror and German Teutonic design, which is in our movie as well. It's something that always seems to work. We've got Lord of the Rings and things like that. Yeah. English character acting, German design. Separate the two out, and it's not necessary. You can have that Teutonic feel, but then have a lack of maybe warmth and engagement in terms of art direction, cultural specifics, or you can have purely English character acting, and then there's just a smaller scale world. But that scale of world and that kind of UK character acting, I think it's a wonderful kind of cultural blend. And yeah, Dark Ages mythology, such as Beowulf. I've illustrated books for Penguin. I illustrated a book on Beowulf and a book on witchcraft and a bit of time illustrations as well. And concept art for NBC's Rise of the Witches, which all have this kind of, the mixture of painting, cinematic, and mythological elements that we're talking about. Back to love of Homeric quests, which we have in our film. Excalibur, Arthurian quests. Eisenstein's Ivan the Terrible, which is a film where that was an attempt in the Soviet era to create like an operatic intensity in the film in terms of lighting, decor, the Prokofiev score, the scale of it. Yeah, you see when my waffle runs out. I was interested in, Dark Ages mythology, things like the god Odin, where you have. No, I didn't say that. Cut that.
Sure.
Specific. I mean, there was specific inspiration in the original brief that I gave out for the animation company was from F.W. Murnau's Faust, which is a silent movie, and where he had this incredible chiaroscuro based on medieval artists like Dürer, and then later artists like Rembrandt. Very Northern European, strong light sources, sculpted with light, which feel that kind of, to me, matched the Games Workshop box art. Interesting enough, like Robert Eggs has recently remade Nosferatu and giving this very kind of fine tone, 20th century spin. In a way, I was looking at Murnau as well. His version of Faust as inspiration, because the sort of spiritual kind of concision and power of silent cinema, something so very cool. Get that into film. My family come from the Midlands, and my grandfather, who was a working class man, not educated but had an affinity for certain things, and one of them, the only French film you like was Wages of Fear, which is like pure action. It's action, but the universe is captured in action. In these guys driving trucks of nitroglycerin at any moment and you get a much bigger world view of global exploitation captured in that. And then, you know, talking with like music, you know, the intensity of punk or, you know, Stooges and stuff like that. It's again like it's not over. It's quite gritty and low level and intimate. You know, you're in a small space with that physicality. And again, with kind of frame ripping and the cross cutting and trying to get down there and in the action. Yeah. Rather than sort of, you know, being stuck with too much pageantry and being kind of far, you're trying to get into that physicality of the world.
Yeah. I mean, a huge amount of like artistic inspiration going into the film, and a lot of effort, it sounds like, into the creation of the film. Obviously, only working on it for 12 months is astonishing to me. That seems like such a quick turnaround to create the movie. I mean, how did it go in terms of the release? What was the sort of reception like, and how did it perform?
Well, I mean, it reached its audience, definitely. It was viewed by millions, but it was very heavily pirated.
Right.
What the plan was, again, because it was going to be niche to Warhammer fans, there'd be limited theatrical, which there was. And then the first point of contact that they could really get their hands on it was this box set that had DVDs in it, you know, the DVD of the movie, making of, and then a graphic novel backstory. And you know, in a lovely art director team. And this went out at a certain price, which meant that not every fan bought it, but the fans that did buy it, because they're tech savvy, because they are Warhammer fans, could pirate it. So it became #1 pirated movie in the world.
Wow.
All the Hollywood releases. So lots of people saw it. Yeah.
Right. Incredible, yeah.
And I think in terms of reaction, I mean, obviously, you know, there's some great reaction, but I think some reaction was the expectation had been that it would be at a 300 level, but we had like less than 1/10 of that budget. And the thing with CGI is that it is mathematical. Production value, it's mathematical. You know, I always think this. It's changing now. You can, you know, with all the software, it can get a lot faster and more fluid and more accessible, but it is mathematical. And if with live action, you can shoot a pretty low budget movie and get away with a lot. You know, if you or I knew Michael Fassbender, he lived next door, and we know. And in between his big gigs, we'd often have the afternoon just film them on our phones. We'd still get his performance. All the texture of his face would be there. Not the phone would get HD quality. It'd be pretty good. But with animation, the render is still a big thing. Getting all that realism texture. So, hence my, you know, film noir approach. You know, and big reason that I was involved was that I bring a style to it that would be a lot of this expressionistic tone and lighting that would gum the live action into the world and give an overall tone that would settle it back. But you know, still, you know, it wasn't going to be at a Marvel movie level. But what I found over the years, I think initially people, you know, because it was just held, here's the first Warhammer, I think there was that reception. But now I find like I get fans coming to me all the time saying how much they enjoyed it, and they respond happily to what was put into it, which is, you know, the script which I received, the voice acting, and the fidelity to the grimdark tone that we kept throughout the film. You know, which was very important. Because we had £6 million to make this film over a timeline of a feature film. And of course, the film comes out and it gets compared to what people had previously, which was like game cinematics, which might be £2 million for something that's like a minute or 2 minutes, yes,
right,
or more, or much more, you know. So it's that proportion of production value to what's on the screen.
Yeah. Gosh, I didn't realize that a sort of game cinematic would cost that much. But then I guess that it's a trailer, isn't it? It's often selling the
Yeah,
product, so it's
at
going
the
to be a
top
big
end,
investment.
and absolutely, it's a top end, and of course, all power to them. I mean, they're beautifully done.
Mm,
They've got top end talent working on them. It's wonderful work. Yeah,
mm, yeah,
need our resources more spread out.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. And it does feel like there is a bit of a reappraisal as well, and it's found a sort of place in the nostalgic hearts of many. Looking back on it, it was the first attempt to bring the world to life in this medium and to you know try and tell a space marine story. And because of a lot of that faithful recreation of the world, it belongs in the 40K universe, which I think is a testament to
Yeah.
its success in that way. I mean, as you look back on it now from a career perspective and from a creative perspective, like, do you ever think back, okay, I would have done this differently, or I would have tackled that, or there was this thing I didn't get to explore? Like, is there anything left undone, or are you quite sort of happy with how it all turned out?
Well, obviously, first of all, um, it was a fantastic opportunity. You know, it was great to work with Games Workshop. Massive respect for how authentic Games Workshop is as a mythology that's built up from grassroots organically over time. That was very
Hmm.
cool. Um, and also, I'm the UK film director. It's my first feature, and £6 million is not a huge budget for CGI, but it's good for a first feature,
Hmm.
and that's great. That's wonderful. And I think we did pretty well. I think we did pretty well with it. I mean, the only thing I'd say is that perhaps more of my stylization and specific art tone in terms of the expressionistic lighting, the frame whipping, the texturing, all of that. I could have pushed that further with more time, but there are all these financial things going on. They're just practical reality. Because there's a certain amount of time it's planned. It's got to be delivered a certain amount of time because you've got investors who've invested in the movie. They want to see their money back. Or they want to see the point in time where it's going to come back and get a return. So you've got to deliver on time. And you've got an insurance company, a bond company, making sure that happens as well. And then within that, the size of the pie of the time, a lot of that time also was not only the practical straight ahead stuff, casting it, directing the actors, directing the animation, all of that, but then also the very in-depth discussions with Games Workshop in terms of the detailing on it, which often would be conversations going back and forth.
Hmm.
Because I remember a particular one. I remember right at the beginning. You mentioned earlier, Jordan, the stained glass window.
Sure.
On the ship. Okay, we're setting the first weeks of production. Okay, great. We march from a crag. Okay, some crags hanging in the window. Is it possible? Email goes off to them. What's a McCrag look like? There was no, at that time, there was no definitive image of it.
Right.
And it was from, there were certain allusions to it visually, but a lot of it's in literature, okay, in the books that existed. So we had to piece all that together and keep on doing drawings and send it back and back and back. Oh, not quite like that. Stuff like that. That all went through a process of until we got something that looked like, okay, that's how McCrag could reasonably look.
Mm.
Yeah. That's how McCrag should look. And then we could put that in the same glass and move on that shot. But a lot of time was doing things like that. That's the most notable one I remember because that was such an important thing.
Mm.
It was like, it was like a World War II film. It's like, what does St. Paul's look like? You know
Sure.
that, but this was like a big thing. So, a lot of time. So a lot of time was what I'm getting to is a lot of time would go on with that, which
Mm.
pushed the slice of pie in terms of the extra layering of creative stuff on top of it. So I would like to do more with that tone of that area in the future, but bring more of my personal tone and artwork and concept stuff to that and really refine that further. I mean, it's not like it's not there in the film. You do have the fragmentation. You do have the, I mentioned Q53, the painting the pixels technique that we used on that, which is where you smear live action to give it a painted effect. Digital painting. That appears in the flashback with the walk gates. There's a lot of it in there, but I could go further and experiment with the technology as well in terms of doing it. That's the only thing. But, anyone would say, any director, if they're being honest, would say that on a film.
Sure. Yeah.
It's all bigger at time. I don't think there's anything in particular that was
sure.
It's tricky.
Yeah. Well, I've really enjoyed this conversation, Martyn. So thank you so much for joining me and sharing your reflections on the making of the movie.
Thank you very much, Joylin. It's been a pleasure.
Many thanks to Martyn for taking the time to chat to me about his experiences creating the film Ultramarines and for sharing so much insight and background material. It was genuinely fascinating and has absolutely given me a new appreciation for the making of the movie. If you would like to see my reflections when I revisited the movie Ultramarines, as well as the other 40k movie Inquisitor from the mid-90s, you can check out a video on my main Jordan Sorcery channel. If it's not out yet, it will be out soon, and I'm going to go through all of my thoughts about those films and what it's like to come back to them after many years. And if you would like to support my work researching and documenting the history of Games Workshop and Warhammer and interviewing the people who made it, then you can do so by checking out my Patreon via the link in the description below. You'll get early and exclusive access to content, articles, research, and lots of other fun stuff. If you're able to support there, I would really, really appreciate it. Thank you once again to Martyn. Thank you for joining us. I'm Jordan, and this is Jordan Sorcery.